On a morning in the autumn of 1973, a 39-year-old naturalized American citizen named Karl František Koecher presented his newly issued contractor identification card at the main security checkpoint of the Central Intelligence Agency's headquarters complex in Langley, Virginia. The guard at the checkpoint examined the laminated card, compared the photograph against the face of the man standing before him, a compact, well-dressed European with wire-rimmed glasses and a slightly formal bearing, and handed it back without comment. Koecher clipped the badge to the lapel of his jacket, proceeded through the security door, and walked into one of the most sensitive intelligence facilities on Earth. He had been waiting 11 years for this moment. Koecher was assigned to the CIA's Directorate of Operations, specifically to the Soviet Division, where he would work as a contract translator and interpreter. His job was to render into English the intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and debriefing transcripts that arrived from the agency's operations, targeting the Soviet Union and its allies. He held a security clearance, granting him access to documents classified as secret, with supplemental access to specific compartmented programs. His salary was modest by the standards of the intelligence community, and his position was that of a contractor rather than a staff employee, a distinction that would later carry significant legal and investigative implications. What the CIA did not know on that autumn morning in 1973, what its background investigators had failed to discover, what its polygraph examiners had not detected, and what its security apparatus had been unable to uncover through months of review, was that the man who had just passed through their checkpoint had been recruited by Czechoslovak intelligence approximately 11 years earlier, and that every step he had taken in the intervening decade, including his emigration to the United States, his education at one of America's most prestigious universities, his work at an American broadcasting service, and his careful cultivation of contacts within the U.S. government had been undertaken according to a plan developed by officers of the Státní, bezpečnost, the Czechoslovak secret police, known by its abbreviation as the STB, with the knowledge and support of the Soviet KGB. Karl Koecher was not a defector who had turned against his country. He was not a disaffected bureaucrat seeking asylum. He was not an accidental spy who had fallen into espionage through circumstance or coercion. He was an intelligence officer operating under deep cover, executing a penetration operation against the CIA that had been designed with the explicit purpose of placing a trained agent inside American intelligence. He had succeeded, and he would continue passing intelligence to his handlers for more than a decade after that morning in 1973. Though his time inside CIA headquarters itself would prove far shorter and far more damaging than the years of active espionage that followed. His case would not become public knowledge for 11 more years. When it did, it would force a reckoning within the intelligence community about the adequacy of its security procedures, the reliability of its vetting processes, and the fundamental question of how a foreign agent had managed to penetrate CIA headquarters at the height of the Cold War and remain undetected for so long. It would also raise questions, quieter, more uncomfortable questions, about the human cost of what Koecher had done, about the individuals whose identities and secrets he had exposed, and about the men and women who had died, in part because of information he had passed to his handlers on the other side of the Iron Curtain. If you're drawn to the documented stories of Cold War espionage and the real human consequences behind intelligence operations, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover cases like this every week, built entirely from the historical record. Now, back to the man who had been waiting 11 years for this moment. Karl František Koecher was born on April 14th, 1934, in Bratislava, then part of Czechoslovakia, to a middle-class family whose circumstances changed dramatically with the political upheavals of the post-war period. His father had been a professional of modest means, and Karl had grown up in an environment shaped by the successive, ideological transformations that swept through Central Europe during the 1930s and 1940s, the fascist occupation, the Soviet liberation, and ultimately the communist consolidation of power in 1948, when Czechoslovakia became a satellite state of the Soviet Union under a government loyal to Moscow. Koecher was, by multiple accounts, an intellectually gifted and deeply ambitious young man. He studied philosophy and linguistics at university in Bratislava, before later pursuing advanced academic work, developing the facility with language that would eventually make him valuable to multiple competing intelligence services. He was fluent in Czech and Slovak by birth, acquired German during his formative years, and would eventually command English and Russian at a level of proficiency that allowed him to move between all four languages with professional confidence. This facility with language would define both his official career and his clandestine one. His early professional life in Czechoslovakia was shaped by the complex social and political landscape of communist Eastern Europe. Individuals with intelligence and ambition navigated a system in which advancement required not only competence, but ideological reliability, or at least the convincing performance of it. Koecher later described his political views during this period in ways that were deliberately ambiguous, sometimes suggesting genuine communist conviction and other times suggesting calculated conformism. What is documented is that by the early 1960s, he had attracted the attention of the Státní, bezpečnost. The STB's interest in Koecher was not accidental. By the early 1960s, Czechoslovak intelligence, working in close coordination with the KGB, had developed sophisticated programs for placing long-term agents in Western countries, a strategy sometimes called deep cover or illegal operations. These programs required individuals who were intelligent, adaptable, linguistically capable, and patient, people who could spend years, even decades, building a credible identity in a foreign country before being activated for specific intelligence tasks. Koecher possessed all of these qualities, and his linguistic abilities, combined with his academic credentials, made him an attractive candidate for a penetration operation targeting the United States. The precise circumstances of his recruitment have never been fully disclosed in declassified records, but according to statements Koecher himself made during subsequent FBI debriefings and in interviews he gave years later in Prague, the initial contact was made sometime around 1962. He was approached by officers of the STB, who presented the operation to him in terms that he later described as both ideological and professional. He would be serving the interests of the socialist world against the aggressive imperialism of the United States, and he would be doing so in a way that matched his particular skills and ambitions. Whether Koecher was driven primarily by ideological conviction, professional opportunity, or some mixture of the two remained a question he answered differently at different points in his life. What is documented is that he agreed, and that what followed was a period of extensive preparation. Koecher was trained in tradecraft, the practical skills of intelligence work that include surveillance detection, secure communication, the use of dead drops, the management of cover stories, and the psychological disciplines required to maintain a false identity over an extended period. He was given a specific mission: to emigrate to the United States, to build a legitimate professional identity, to obtain positions that would give him access to classified information or to individuals with such access, and to pass that information to his handlers through communication channels that would be established and maintained throughout his career. The cover story developed for Koecher's emigration was built around a narrative that would have been immediately legible to Western intelligence agencies. He was a disillusioned intellectual, a man of genuine ability who had grown frustrated with the restrictions of communist society and was seeking freedom and professional opportunity in the West. This narrative was not entirely false. Koecher was genuinely frustrated with aspects of communist bureaucracy, and he genuinely desired the wider intellectual and professional opportunities that the West offered, but the frustration and the desire were being instrumentalized in service of an operation whose ultimate purpose was to damage the very system he was presenting himself as seeking to join. In 1965, Karl Koecher and his wife, Hana, emigrated from Czechoslovakia. Hana Koecher, born in 1942, was several years younger than her husband and was by accounts a strikingly attractive woman with intelligence and social facility that would prove important to the operation they were executing together. The Koechers traveled first to Vienna and then made their way to the United States, entering the country with refugee status. They settled in New York City, where Karl enrolled in graduate studies at Columbia University. The choice of Columbia was strategic. The university was one of the country's premier intellectual institutions, with extensive connections to the foreign policy and national security establishments. A doctorate from Columbia in philosophy, combined with demonstrated linguistic expertise, would provide an excellent platform for the kind of positions that Koecher had been tasked with obtaining. The years at Columbia were, in their public dimensions, exactly what they were supposed to appear: the graduate school years of an Eastern European intellectual refugee, working his way through an American doctoral program with the mixture of energy and financial constraint that characterized the experience of many immigrant students of the period. Koecher was a capable student who engaged seriously with the intellectual life of the university. He formed relationships with faculty and fellow students that were real, in the sense that they involved genuine intellectual exchange and professional mentorship. The people he met at Columbia knew him as a European intellectual with an interesting background, strong opinions, and the particular intensity that characterized people who had lived through political upheaval and come out the other side with their ambitions intact. None of them knew, or had any basis for knowing, that his presence in their program was the result of an operation planned in Prague, that the affability and engagement he displayed were, at least in part, the performance of a man trained in the management of identity and relationship, and that the friendships he formed were being used, not necessarily cynically, and perhaps not even consciously in every case, in service of a mission that the people he was befriending knew nothing about. He completed his doctoral degree in approximately 1970, having written a dissertation in philosophy. He applied for and received American citizenship in 1971, becoming a naturalized citizen, a status that would ultimately prove essential to his ability to obtain a CIA security clearance, since the agency required citizenship as a prerequisite for employment, and could not, under standard procedures of the period, grant clearances to foreign nationals. His citizenship application was approved without any indication that the security background check had surfaced concerns. While working toward his degree, Koecher had also obtained employment with Radio Free Europe, the American-funded broadcasting organization whose mission was to transmit news and information into Soviet-bloc countries. His work at Radio Free Europe gave him access to emigrate communities from Eastern Europe, to information about U.S. broadcasting strategy toward communist countries, and to the organizational networks that connected American intelligence interests with Eastern European exile groups. It also gave him credibility. A Czechoslovak intellectual who had worked for Radio Free Europe was precisely the kind of individual that the CIA might consider for positions involving translation and analysis of Soviet-bloc material. What the employment also gave him, and what his handlers in Prague would have valued, was insight into the methods and people involved in American efforts to reach audiences inside the Soviet bloc. The emigre communities that gathered around Radio Free Europe represented for Eastern European intelligence services a particular category of intelligence interest, individuals who had left their home countries, who maintained connections and views that might be of operational significance, and whose activities the STB and KGB monitored with care. Koecher's position within that community gave his handlers a window into it that they would not otherwise have had. By approximately 1972 or 1973, Koecher had made contact with the CIA's recruitment apparatus and presented himself as a candidate for contract work involving translation. His qualifications were on paper impressive: doctoral education from Columbia, native fluency in Czech and Slovak, strong Russian and German, American citizenship, and a professional background that included work for a U.S. government-funded broadcasting organization. His background investigation, conducted by the CIA's Security Division, apparently found no disqualifying information. His polygraph examination, the agency's standard screening tool for new personnel, reportedly did not raise sufficient concerns to prevent his hiring. He was given a security clearance and assigned to the Soviet division. The precise vulnerabilities in the CIA's vetting process that allowed Koecher to pass through remain, to some degree, classified. What is known from subsequent reviews and from the FBI's investigation is that the background investigation failed to surface the connections between Koecher and the Czechoslovak intelligence service that existed in the record of his life in Bratislava and Prague. Whether this failure resulted from inadequate investigation, from the inherent limitations of background checks in countries where records were controlled by hostile governments, or from some other factor, it represented a profound security failure, one whose consequences would extend far beyond the career of a single translator. The work that Karl Koecher performed at CIA headquarters during the period of his contract employment was, in a narrow professional sense, competent and valuable. He translated Soviet intelligence materials, working from Russian and Czech into English, producing the kind of rendered documents that intelligence analysts depended upon to understand the contents of intercepted communications, agent reports, and foreign documents that the agency obtained through its various collection programs. He was reportedly a skilled and efficient translator, capable of handling technical as well as political and administrative material. His supervisors appear to have regarded him as reliable, punctual, and professionally discreet, qualities that made him an asset in the quiet, methodical world of intelligence translation. His routine at Langley was, in its outward dimensions, the routine of any government contractor. He arrived at the facility in the mornings, passed through the security checkpoint, proceeded to his workspace within the Soviet Division's translation unit, and spent his hours working through the documents assigned to him. The work was, by its nature, solitary. A translator sits alone with a document, rendering it from one language into another, without necessarily understanding the full context of what he is handling or where it has come from. This procedural isolation, which existed for legitimate security reasons, limiting the degree to which any single contractor could accumulate a comprehensive picture of any single operation, was, paradoxically, one of the features of the environment that made Koecher's work manageable for him. He was exposed to significant quantities of sensitive intelligence, without always being given the context that would have allowed him to assess its full significance, but the aggregate of what he handled over approximately 2 years of contract work was nevertheless enormous. The Soviet division to which he was assigned was at the time one of the most active and consequential directorates within the CIA's operational structure. It was responsible for the agency's collection operations targeting the Soviet Union, the recruitment and handling of human sources inside Soviet institutions, the analysis of communications intercepts, and the evaluation of intelligence from a range of technical and human sources. The documents that flowed through the division's translation unit reflected the breadth of these activities, touching on Soviet military programs, diplomatic communications, internal political discussions within the Soviet leadership, and, critically, the identities and activities of individuals within the Soviet system who were in contact with American intelligence. He was also during this period committing espionage on a systematic basis. The precise mechanism by which Koecher communicated with his handlers during the years of his CIA employment has been established through the FBI investigation and subsequent court proceedings, though the full details of the communication protocols used remain partially classified. According to available records, Koecher used a combination of personal meetings with Czechoslovak intelligence officers during overseas travel, dead drop exchanges in the Washington and New York areas, and coded communications to pass information to his handlers, who in turn shared it with the KGB. The information he passed was categorically sensitive in ways that went beyond the individual documents he translated. Because his work required him to handle materials related to ongoing CIA operations targeting the Soviet Union and its allies, what he saw, and what he passed, included information about the methods the CIA used to collect intelligence, about the communications that the agency was able to intercept, about the identities and cover names of CIA case officers and assets, and, critically, about individuals inside the Soviet-bloc who were providing information to American intelligence. These individuals, referred to within the CIA as assets or agents, were among the most vulnerable people in the world. Their survival depended entirely on the confidentiality of their identities. If a foreign intelligence service learned who they were, they would be arrested. Under Soviet and Eastern European law and practice, the consequence of arrest for espionage was, in many documented cases, execution. Among the materials that passed through Koecher's hands during his time at the CIA was information related to a Soviet diplomat named Alexander Dmitrievich Ogorodnik. Ogorodnik had been recruited by the CIA during the early 1970s, reportedly approached by agency officers while serving abroad as a Soviet Foreign Ministry official posted to Bogota, Colombia. He had agreed to spy for the Americans, and for several years he had provided his CIA handlers with information of significant intelligence value about Soviet foreign policy deliberations and diplomatic activities. Within the CIA, he was known by the operational cryptonym Trigon. Ogorodnik was, by the accounts that have entered the historical record, a man of considerable intelligence and ambition who chafed under the restrictions of Soviet bureaucratic life. He had been born in 1939 and had worked his way through the Soviet diplomatic system into positions that gave him access to sensitive information about Soviet foreign policy planning. His motivations for cooperating with the CIA appeared to have been a mixture of ideological disillusionment, personal frustration, and the appeal, common to individuals recruited by intelligence services on both sides of the Cold War, of playing a secret and consequential role that his official life denied him. He was given the operational tools that CIA provided to valued assets, means of photographing documents, protocols for communicating with his handlers, and, as a provision against the worst-case scenario, a cyanide capsule concealed inside a pen, to be used if capture became inevitable. The existence of that capsule was itself a measure of how clearly both Ogorodnik and his handlers understood the stakes. For several years, the Trigon operation produced intelligence that was regarded within the CIA as valuable. The reports that Ogorodnik provided, translated into the analytical language of the intelligence community, informed American understanding of Soviet foreign policy in ways that had practical significance. He was, by the measure of the intelligence world, a successful and productive asset, a human being whose willingness to take extraordinary personal risks was generating real information for the people who depended on him. The precise role that Koecher's espionage played in Ogorodnik's fate is a question that has been discussed and debated in the intelligence community and in the historical literature for decades without definitive resolution. What is documented is that in 1977, the KGB arrested Alexander Ogorodnik. He died in custody shortly after his arrest, reportedly having bitten down on the cyanide capsule that the CIA had concealed inside a pen provided to him precisely for the contingency that he might be captured. He was approximately 37 years old. Whether information that Koecher had passed to his handlers contributed to the identification of Ogorodnik cannot be stated with absolute certainty on the basis of publicly available records. The KGB's counterintelligence operations against the CIA were complex and drew on multiple sources of information. Counterintelligence analysts who examined the case in subsequent years concluded that there was reason to believe Koecher's espionage was among the factors that contributed to Trigon's exposure, though other possibilities, including the counterintelligence work of other sources, the activities of other moles within American intelligence, or investigative methods employed by the KGB independently of any agent information, could not be ruled out. What is not in question is that Ogorodnik was dead, that his death was a direct consequence of his exposure, and that Koecher's time inside the CIA had provided Soviet and Czechoslovak intelligence with a window into the agency's Soviet operations that was of incalculable value to them and of potentially lethal consequence to the individuals that window exposed. Koecher's contract work with the CIA apparently concluded around 1975. The reasons for the conclusion of his contract have not been fully detailed in declassified materials. He continued to be active as an intelligence asset for the STB after leaving the CIA, utilizing the contacts and the knowledge he had accumulated during his years in Langley. He and Hana continued to live in New York, where Karl took up academic and private sector work. They maintained their social connections, which had, throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, extended into circles that included government officials, academics, and professionals with national security connections. Among the aspects of the Koecher's life in the United States that would attract significant attention when the case eventually became public was their participation in what contemporaneous investigative reporting described as a sexually permissive social milieu in New York and Washington. According to reporting from the period and materials cited in subsequent court documents, the Koechers frequented social gatherings characterized by sexual freedom and attended by educated professional Americans, including at establishments such as Plato's Retreat, a club in Manhattan that operated from 1977 until 1985 and attracted a clientele that included, according to investigative accounts from the period, individuals employed in government, law, finance, and media. The FBI's subsequent investigation would establish that this dimension of their social life was not simply a private matter unrelated to their intelligence activities. According to court documents and FBI investigative records, the social network the Koechers cultivated through these connections included individuals with access to classified information, and the intelligence value of these social contacts was explicitly recognized by the STB. Hana Koecher, whose social gifts were described by multiple observers as exceptional, was particularly active in maintaining and developing these relationships. Whether the Koechers used their social connections to actively elicit classified information from the individuals they met, or whether the primary value to their handlers was the network of contacts and the potential access those contacts represented, is a question the FBI investigated intensively. What the investigation established was that the Koechers were not simply a couple whose private social arrangements happened to intersect with their intelligence work. The social life was, at least in part, a professionally deliberate element of the operation they were running. The FBI's investigation of Karl and Hana Koecher did not begin with a single dramatic piece of intelligence. It developed, as many counterintelligence investigations do, through the accumulation of fragments, partial information, suspicious patterns, and the kind of inferential reasoning that counterintelligence work demands. According to accounts that have become available through declassified records and subsequent reporting, the FBI's attention to Koecher developed over a period of years, beginning in the late 1970s and intensifying through the early 1980s. One factor that contributed to the investigation was the broader effort by American counterintelligence agencies to identify the sources of intelligence losses that had become apparent during the late 1970s. The exposure and death of Trigon in 1977 was one of a series of losses that pointed to the possibility of a penetration somewhere within the American intelligence system. Counterintelligence analysts at both the FBI and the CIA were systematically reviewing personnel with access to the programs that had been compromised, looking for common denominators that might indicate where the leak had originated. This process required analysts to identify overlaps between what had been compromised and who had had access to those specific compartments of information, a task made more difficult by the fact that the investigation itself could not be disclosed to the personnel under review. Koecher's name appears to have come to the attention of investigators through multiple channels that converged over time. His background as a Czechoslovak national who had emigrated during the Cold War placed him within a category of individuals who received enhanced scrutiny as a matter of standard counterintelligence practice. His prior association with the CIA, even as a contractor whose employment had concluded, meant that he was subject to the security reviews the agency conducted in connection with its investigation of intelligence losses, and the lifestyle and social connections that the Koechers maintained in New York attracted attention from FBI personnel conducting routine counterintelligence monitoring of the kinds of social environments that Soviet-bloc intelligence services were known to exploit. The surveillance that the FBI conducted of the Koechers during the early 1980s was necessarily conducted with extreme care. Any surveillance operation directed at a trained intelligence officer risks alerting the target, and a compromised surveillance operation can cause the subject to go to ground, destroy evidence, or alert their handlers that the investigation has begun. The FBI agents assigned to the Koecher investigation rotated their surveillance teams with particular frequency, used multiple vehicles and surveillance positions, and exercised unusual patience in following leads that might, if pursued too aggressively, reveal the investigation prematurely. One of the dimensions of the investigation that consumed significant FBI resources was the effort to understand the Koecher's social network and its potential intelligence implications. The social world they had cultivated in New York and Washington was large and diverse, encompassing individuals from multiple professional backgrounds, and the question of which elements of that network had been cultivated for intelligence purposes, and what information, if any, had flowed through those social connections to their handlers, required extensive investigation. FBI agents conducted interviews, reviewed records, and worked to reconstruct the social geography of the Koecher's American life in ways that would support both the criminal case and the intelligence damage assessment. The evidentiary threshold for espionage prosecution was high, and what investigators had assembled, surveillance logs, behavioral patterns, documented overseas contacts, needed to become something a federal jury could be asked to weigh. That process took years and demanded a degree of operational patience that tested the resolve of everyone assigned to the case. On November 27, 1984, that process reached its conclusion. FBI agents arrested Karl Koecher and Hana at separate locations. Karl was taken into custody in Manhattan, where agents approached him in circumstances that reflected the careful choreography of a surveillance operation that had been running for years. According to accounts from agents involved in the arrest, Koecher was composed when taken into custody. He identified himself, was advised of his rights, and requested an attorney. He did not make statements to the agents at the time of his arrest. Hana was arrested separately at John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, where agents intercepted her as she prepared to travel. She too was composed. She too asked for a lawyer. The arrests were made public, and within days the basic outline of the case, a Czechoslovak intelligence officer who had penetrated CIA headquarters, was the subject of reporting in American newspapers. The coverage was extensive and, in some respects, sensationalized, focusing particularly on the social dimension of the Koecher's activities. Karl's penetration of the CIA was described in terms that reflected both the gravity of the security breach and the bewilderment of those who reviewed how it had been possible. The legal proceedings that followed Karl Koecher's arrest were shaped by a set of considerations that made his case substantially more complex than a straightforward criminal prosecution for espionage. Koecher was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage under federal law, a charge that reflected both the gravity of his activities and the specific legal framework available to prosecutors. The potential sentence under the applicable statutes was severe, with the possibility of life imprisonment. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, where the case was filed, moved to proceed with the prosecution. What complicated the legal picture was Koecher's potential value as a source of information about Czechoslovak and Soviet intelligence operations. The knowledge accumulated by an intelligence officer who had operated under deep cover for more than 2 decades, who had been inside CIA headquarters, who had dealt with intelligence handlers on both sides of the Iron Curtain, represented an intelligence asset that counterintelligence agencies on both sides were keenly interested in. American intelligence had an obvious interest in debriefing Koecher as extensively as possible to understand the full scope of the damage he had caused, to identify the communication channels and methods he had used, and to learn whatever he might know about the operations and personnel of the SB and KGB. The Czechoslovak government, meanwhile, had a corresponding interest in recovering Koecher before he could be comprehensively debriefed, and in demonstrating to its own intelligence officers that individuals caught in the service of the state would not be abandoned. The mechanisms of Cold War spy exchanges, which had been practiced since the early 1960s, the most famous being the February 1962 exchange of KGB officer Rudolf Abel for American U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers at the Glayanica Bridge connecting West Berlin to Potsdam, provided a framework through which this interest could be pursued. Throughout 1985, negotiations proceeded on multiple tracks simultaneously. Koecher's legal situation was managed by his attorneys, who engaged with prosecutors about the terms of potential cooperation. The question of a possible exchange was handled through diplomatic channels that involved the State Department, the intelligence agencies, and intermediaries with connections to the Czechoslovak government. The proceedings moved slowly, as such negotiations typically did, and involved the kind of careful protocol management that characterized every Cold War prisoner exchange. Each side had to calculate what it was willing to offer and what it required in return, and neither side could afford to reveal the full extent of its interest without weakening its negotiating position. Koecher, for his part, had his own incentives to cooperate with American debriefers. Cooperation was, in every sense of the term, his currency. Whether he provided American intelligence with information that was genuinely damaging to Czechoslovak or Soviet intelligence operations, or whether he managed his disclosures carefully to protect sources and methods he considered essential to protect, is a question that cannot be answered from the public record. Trained intelligence officers in his position typically gave their debriefers enough to demonstrate cooperation and to maintain the value that made an exchange worth pursuing, while managing the disclosure of information that might compromise ongoing operations or harm colleagues still in the field. For Hana Koecher, the legal situation was somewhat different. FBI investigators had assembled evidence regarding her role in the espionage operation, but the evidentiary picture was less complete than in Karl's case, and the question of what charges could be sustained against her under the applicable legal standards was one that prosecutors assessed carefully. In 1985, Hana Koecher was released from federal custody. Charges against her were eventually dropped, reflecting the difficulty of proving her specific role in the espionage beyond the threshold required for criminal conviction. She remained in the United States temporarily while her husband's situation was resolved. The exchange that resolved Karl Koecher's case occurred on February 11, 1986, on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, the same bridge where the 1962 Powers Able exchange had taken place, and where, over the decades, numerous Cold War prisoner exchanges had been conducted. The bridge, which connected West Berlin to Potsdam in East Germany, had become the physical embodiment of the Cold War's peculiar logic, a place where enemies exchanged human beings under carefully negotiated terms, each side calculating what it was giving up against what it was receiving. The exchange on February 11, 1986, was one of the most significant prisoner transfers in the Cold War's history. The most prominent individual released on the eastern side was Anatoly Shcharansky, known in the West as Natan Sharansky, a Soviet Jewish dissident and human rights activist who had been imprisoned by the Soviet government since 1977 on charges of treason and espionage that Western governments and human rights organizations universally condemned as politically motivated. Sharansky had spent 9 years in Soviet prisons and labor camps, including time in Siberian gulags. His release had been the subject of international advocacy and diplomatic pressure for years. For the Reagan administration and for the broader Western alliance, his release represented a genuine human rights achievement that had required sustained diplomatic effort. Karl Koecher and Hana were among the individuals transferred to the eastern side in exchange. On that February morning, in the cold of a Berlin winter, they crossed the bridge from west to east. Koecher had been in American custody for approximately 14 months. He returned to Czechoslovakia as a man the communist government could claim as a success. An intelligence officer who had penetrated American intelligence, served his mission, and been recovered when captured. For the American counterintelligence community, the exchange was a necessary practical resolution to a situation that had become diplomatically and legally complex. The alternative, prosecuting Koecher to conviction and sentencing him to a lengthy federal prison term, would have produced a definitive legal outcome but would also have foreclosed the possibility of the Sharansky release, a result with significant human rights dimensions that carried weight in American foreign policy calculations of the period. The decision to exchange reflected the same Cold War logic that had governed every previous bridge transfer: human beings as currency, their fates contingent on the calculations of states that had claims upon them. Karl and Hana Koecher returned to Prague, where they would live for the remainder of their lives. For the first 3 years following their return, they lived under a communist government that regarded them as heroes of socialist intelligence, individuals who had served the state with distinction and had been recovered through the diplomatic efforts of their country. Karl was given recognition within the intelligence community. He was by then 51 years old, a veteran intelligence officer whose operational career was effectively over, but whose institutional standing within the Czechoslovak security apparatus was significant. He moved back into the Prague intellectual world with a combination of caution and visibility that reflected his complex position. He was a man whose career was simultaneously a professional triumph. He had penetrated the CIA, which no other Czechoslovak or, by documented account, any other communist intelligence officer had managed to do, and a professional secret, since the details of what he had done and who had been harmed by it were not a subject of open discussion in a country that remained under communist control. He gave no public interviews during this period, made no public statements about his career, and lived in a manner that was conspicuous only in its deliberate inconspicuousness. Then, in November 1989, the Velvet Revolution swept through Czechoslovakia. The communist government, confronted by massive public protests and the collapse of Soviet power throughout Eastern Europe, surrendered authority in a matter of weeks. The new democratic government, led by figures that included the playwright and dissident Václav Havel, who had himself been imprisoned by the communist regime whose intelligence service Koecher had served, began the process of dismantling the institutional structures of the communist state, including the STB. For Karl Koecher, the Velvet Revolution transformed his status from intelligence hero to controversial public figure almost overnight. The new Czechoslovakia was confronting its own past, sorting through decades of surveillance, infiltration, and coercion that the communist security apparatus had imposed on the country's citizens. The disclosure of STB records, which revealed the extent to which the service had penetrated Czech society, recruited informants, and conducted surveillance of ordinary citizens, produced shock and bitterness among a population discovering the dimensions of the system under which they had lived. Officers of the STB found themselves publicly identified and in many cases publicly condemned. The institution that had been the source of Koecher's career and purpose became, within the space of a few months, a byword for the worst aspects of the communist system. In this context, Koecher gave interviews to Czech journalists, appeared in television discussions, and wrote about his experiences in ways that were carefully calibrated to present his career in the most sympathetic possible light. He described himself as a patriot who had served his country according to the principles he held at the time, and who had later watched those principles, and the political system they supported, collapse. He expressed views about his CIA work that were complex, acknowledging the significance of what he had done, while maintaining that his motivations had been legitimate, according to his understanding of the Cold War. He did not, in any of these public presentations, express what could be characterized as straightforward guilt or remorse for the human consequences of his espionage. His discussions of the Trigon case, which had by then become public knowledge through reporting and historical analysis, were carefully hedged. He acknowledged that Ogorodnik had been exposed and had died, but consistently declined to acknowledge definitively that his own intelligence reporting had contributed to that exposure. He maintained that the question of what information he had passed to his handlers and what had been done with it was one he could not fully answer given the compartmentalized nature of intelligence operations. This was, from a technical standpoint, at least partially accurate. Intelligence operations are typically organized in ways that prevent any single participant from knowing the full scope of how their information is used. A translator who handles an intercepted communication cannot always know which part of that communication was acted upon, or how, or with what consequences. But the logic of compartmentalization, which exists for sound operational reasons, also conveniently serves the psychological interest of participants who prefer not to trace the direct connection between their work and its outcomes. The people in Moscow who had known Alexander Ogorodnik, his colleagues in the Soviet Foreign Ministry, the acquaintances who had noticed his arrest and subsequent absence, The family members, who had been given incomplete or false explanations for his disappearance, were part of a world that was also transforming in the late 1980s and early 1990s as the Soviet Union moved toward its own dissolution. In the Soviet system, the families of individuals arrested for espionage were typically not informed of the circumstances of their arrest, the charges against them, or the fate that followed. Ogorodnik's family, in the years following his 1977 arrest, lived with whatever account had been provided to them, an account that was almost certainly not the truth. The fuller story of Trigon's exposure and death reached the public domain gradually through the work of journalists and historians who pieced it together from CIA records, former officer testimony, and Soviet archives that became partially accessible after the Soviet collapse. The story eventually reached a broader audience through historical literature on CIA Cold War operations, and elements of his case, along with those of other Cold War assets, informed the fictional dramatizations of that era that appeared in subsequent decades, including the FX series The Americans, which aired from 2013 to 2018 and drew extensively on the documented history of Soviet deep cover operations in the United States. Ogorodnik appeared in the factual literature as a figure whose courage and subsequent fate embodied the human dimension of Cold War intelligence in its starkest form, a man who had trusted an institution to protect him and who had died because that institution had been penetrated from within. What is not in question is the human cost of his death and the cost borne by those connected to him. He had been a man in his late 30s, a Soviet diplomat who had taken the risk of working for American intelligence during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. His decision had been his own, made with knowledge of the consequences if he were caught, but the protection he had been promised, the security that should have been provided by the counterintelligence measures of the agency that had recruited him, had been undermined from within the very institution that should have protected him. He had died in Soviet custody, alone, while his handlers in Langley were unaware that they had been penetrated, that the information he provided had been compromised, and that the man who had compromised it had spent 2 years walking through their security checkpoint every morning. The other CIA assets whose identities or activities may have been exposed through Koecher's espionage represent a category of human cost that is even more difficult to document precisely. Koecher's access during his time at the CIA was substantial, and the counterintelligence damage assessment conducted by the CIA and the FBI in the years following his arrest concluded that the compromise was serious. Damage assessments in espionage cases are inherently uncertain documents. They attempt to reconstruct what was known, what was communicated, and what effect that communication had, a reconstruction made more difficult by the fact that hostile services have no incentive to disclose what they received or how they used it. What the damage assessment did establish was that Koecher had handled materials across a range of CIA programs, and that the information accessible to him had included details of operations and individuals that were among the most sensitive the agency possessed. The full number of people whose security may have been compromised, who may have faced investigation, arrest, imprisonment, or death as a result of intelligence that flowed, directly or indirectly, from Koecher's work, is not knowable with certainty from the public record. It is knowable only in its human dimension, that behind every compromised operation there were human beings whose lives were affected by the breach, and that the breach had been sustained and systematic over a period of years. The STB officers who had recruited and run Karl Koecher, who had conceived the operation, managed its execution, and maintained contact with him across the full arc of his American life, faced consequences quite different from those experienced by their asset. The principal handlers and architects of the Koecher operation remained in Czechoslovakia, protected by their government's immunity from American legal process throughout the Cold War period. After the Velvet Revolution, some of them faced scrutiny from the new democratic government's investigations into the activities of the communist security apparatus. The lustration laws enacted by the Czech and Slovak governments in the early 1990s created procedures for identifying and restricting the public roles of former STB officers and collaborators. Some of those involved in running the Koecher operation were affected by these processes, though the specific consequences varied considerably depending on the individual case and the degree of documented involvement. The KGB officers in Moscow who had received the intelligence product of the Koecher operation, who had read the translated CIA materials, identified the assets and operations they illuminated, and used that information to direct their counterintelligence activities, faced no legal consequences of any kind. The Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991 ended the KGB as an institution, and its successor organizations continued their work under different names. The officers of the former KGB who had benefited from Koecher's espionage retired, in many cases with institutional honor, into the post-Soviet security establishment. At the CIA, the Koecher case prompted a comprehensive review of the security procedures that had failed to prevent his penetration and had failed to detect it during his years of employment. The questions raised by the review were not comfortable ones. The polygraph examination, which the CIA regarded as a cornerstone of its personnel security, had not detected Koecher's deception. The background investigation had not surfaced his STB connection. The need to know protocols that were supposed to limit any single individual's access to sensitive information had apparently not prevented him from seeing materials whose combined significance was substantial. Subsequent reviews identified specific gaps in the polygraph protocols of the period. A polygraph, the reviews noted, is a measure of stress response, not a detector of identity, and a sufficiently trained and disciplined subject can manage the physiological indicators that the machine measures in ways that limit its effectiveness as a screening tool. Reforms were made. The background investigation process for contractors was lengthened and deepened. Access to the most sensitive compartments of information was further restricted, and more frequent security reviews were implemented for personnel with access to the most sensitive programs. Whether those reforms were sufficient was tested by subsequent cases. In 1994, counterintelligence investigators arrested Aldrich Ames, a senior CIA officer who had been working as a Soviet intelligence asset since 1985, a recruitment that overlapped with the final years of the Koecher investigation and the early years of the post-exchange period. In 2001, FBI agent Robert Hansen was arrested after having passed classified information to Soviet and Russian intelligence since 1979. Each new penetration revealed that the reforms implemented after previous cases had not closed all of the vulnerabilities that a trained and patient intelligence officer operating with institutional support and long-term planning could exploit. Each new case forced the same reckoning with the same fundamental question: how does an institution protect its secrets against people who have been specifically trained to appear trustworthy? Karl Koecher lived in Prague for the remainder of his life, outlasting the political system he had served, the intelligence service that had trained him, and the ideology whose advancement he had cited as his motivation. He became, in the Czech Republic's post-communist intellectual landscape, something of an anomalous figure, a man whose career connected the Cold War past to the democratic present in ways that made him both interesting and uncomfortable to confront. He was interviewed by historians, appeared in documentaries, gave talks, and eventually wrote about his experiences in formats that preserved his perspective while maintaining the professional reserve of a trained intelligence officer who had long since learned what not to say. Hana Koecher remained with her husband following the exchange and the return to Prague. The question of her precise role in the espionage operation, whether she was a fully trained intelligence officer who participated actively in the mission, or a spouse who was aware of and supportive of her husband's activities without herself being an operational agent, was one that the FBI investigation had examined extensively and had not fully resolved. Charges against her in the United States had been dropped, but she had not been publicly exonerated, and the ambiguity of her status in the case persisted. In Prague, she and Karl maintained a life that was by external observation quiet and domestic, far removed from the operational world that had defined their American years. Alexander Ogorodnik, the Soviet diplomat whose fate, remains the most starkly documented human consequence of Koecher's espionage, had been dead since 1977, 9 years before Koecher returned to Prague, and decades before Koecher gave his most extensive public interviews. Ogorodnik's death remained what it had always been, the permanent consequence of a breach that could not be undone, the human endpoint of an espionage chain that had begun in Prague, passed through Langley, and terminated in a KGB interrogation room. Karl Koecher died in Prague. The exact circumstances of his death and the date on which it occurred are not, as of the public record, definitively confirmed with the kind of documented precision that attends the deaths of public figures in democratic societies. He had been in declining health in his later years, and he had outlived, by decades, the political system whose intelligence service had given his life its central organizing purpose. In the years before his death, in the interviews he gave and the accounts he provided to historians and journalists, he returned consistently to the framework that had allowed him to understand his own life, the Cold War as a conflict between systems, his role as one piece of a vast intelligence architecture, his choices as the choices of a man operating according to the values he held, and the commitments he had made in his youth. He never broke from this framework entirely, and he never provided a reckoning with its consequences that those consequences would have required. He was 31 years old when he arrived in the United States, carrying a false mission inside a real life. He was 39 when he walked through the security checkpoint at CIA headquarters for the first time. He was 50 when he was arrested in Manhattan, and 51 when he was exchanged on a Berlin bridge in the February cold. He lived for decades after that, in the country he had served, watching it transform into something unrecognizable from the system he had given his career to protect. The question that the Koecher case raises most persistently and most uncomfortably is how it was possible, not in the narrow security procedural sense, though that question has legitimate importance, but in the broader human sense. How does a person commit himself, in his 20s, to a mission that will define the next 4 decades of his life, require him to sustain a false identity across multiple institutions and relationships, and ultimately require him to pass information that he must have understood could result in the deaths of people he had never met? Koecher's explanations, offered at various points over the decades, mixed ideological justification, professional pride, and something that sounded, at times, like regret without quite achieving it. He spoke of the Cold War as a context in which individuals on both sides operated according to the logic of their respective systems, each convinced of the righteousness of their cause and the necessity of their methods. He was not wrong about this as a description of the Cold War's operational reality, but describing a system does not dissolve the question of individual responsibility within it. Karl Koecher made choices. He chose to accept the Seat B's recruitment. He chose to emigrate under false pretenses. He chose to lie to the security officers who conducted his CIA background investigation, to the polygraph examiners who questioned him, to the colleagues who worked alongside him at Langley, and to the American friends and social acquaintances whose company he enjoyed and whose trust he accepted. He made those choices not once, but continuously, over more than 2 decades, each day renewing a deception that served the interests of a foreign intelligence service against the country that had granted him citizenship. He made those choices within a system that had trained him, structured his options, and provided him with the professional and ideological framework within which those choices seemed coherent, even justified. The STB and KGB that directed his operation were themselves operating within political systems that determined what information was collected, how it was used, and what purposes it served. The Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union created the conditions in which Koecher's operation existed and had meaning. None of this changes what he did, but it situates it in a way that resists the simple accounting of pure individual villainy. The individuals who worked alongside Koecher at CIA headquarters, who handed him classified documents to translate, who greeted him in hallways, who trusted that the security apparatus of their institution had verified his reliability, bore no responsibility for what he was doing. They were people doing their jobs within systems they trusted to protect them from exactly the kind of threat that Koecher represented. Their trust was misplaced, and the failure was not theirs. The same is true, in different ways, of the American social acquaintances the Koechers cultivated, the officials whose company they kept, and the ordinary people whose government's intelligence service they were systematically undermining. And Alexander Ogorodnik, who had made his own choice to work for the CIA, and who had died for it, was neither a pawn nor a symbol. He was a specific human being with his own reasons for his choices, his own understanding of the risks he was taking, and his own people who missed him when he was gone. He had relied, as every intelligence asset relies, on the good faith and competence of the service that recruited him. The breach in that good faith was not something he had consented to or could have anticipated. It was a failure that came from inside the walls of the institution that was supposed to protect him. What Koecher left behind in the United States was, in the most precise accounting, a set of harms that could not be fully tallied, intelligence programs disrupted, operations compromised, assets exposed, at least one person dead. The specific damage that his espionage caused was assessed and classified and incorporated into the institutional memory of the agencies that had been penetrated. But the human cost, the particular texture of Alexander Ogorodnik's last days in KGB custody, the fear experienced by other CIA assets who may not have known they had been exposed, the ordinary Americans who worked alongside a communist spy inside the country's most sensitive intelligence institution without knowing it, that cost was not assessed in any document. It was absorbed, person by person, into the ordinary catastrophe of the Cold War's human toll. The photograph that exists of Karl Koecher from this period, the kind of mid-career professional photograph that found its way into the CIA's records and later into the FBI's investigative file, shows a man who looks unremarkable, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, a compact bearing, the expression of someone accustomed to presenting himself in a particular way for a particular audience. It is the face of a man who had spent years learning to look like something he was not. It is also, inescapably, the face of a human being who had made choices he would spend the rest of his life explaining to anyone who asked, choices whose consequences had outlasted the world that produced them, the ideology that justified them, and the man who had made them. The security checkpoint at CIA headquarters in Langley, where he had presented his contractor badge in the autumn of 1973, was replaced and upgraded in the decades following his exposure. The procedures he had passed through were reviewed, reformed, and tightened. The institution he had penetrated worked to ensure that the particular failure his case represented would not be repeated. Whether it fully succeeded is a question that, by the nature of counterintelligence, cannot be answered with certainty, because the operations that have not been discovered are not known, and the agents who have not yet been caught are not yet in the record. That uncertainty, persistent and irresolvable, is perhaps the most accurate summary of what Karl Koecher's case ultimately demonstrated, that the systems built to protect secrets are built by human beings, vetted by human beings, and managed by human beings, and that human beings, for reasons of vanity, conviction, ambition, ideology, or some combination that even they cannot fully explain, are capable of making choices that undermine those systems from within. The badge clipped to the lapel and the quiet morning walk through the checkpoint were in the end just the beginning of what that particular truth cost.